Aloha everyone, and welcome to our third lecture here at Biology 110, People in Nature. Today we'll be talking about whales, whaling, and the whaling industry. So we'll be talking about several different aspects of whaling today. We'll start with a brief history of the whaling industry. We will move on to commercial whaling, then illegal whaling, and then scientific whaling. So humans have been hunting whales for multiple centuries, mainly for their meat and more importantly for their blubber, which can be melted down into whale oils. The very earliest confirmed whale hunters were Norwegians, beginning in the early 9th century. But many other ocean cultures have also used whaling in their traditional hunting methods. For example, the Inuit hunt whales in the Arctic, and the Basque hunt whales in the Atlantic. In fact, we have evidence of whaling that extends all the way back to 6000 BC because we have evidence of tools that look very similar to early harpoons, and they have ropes and lines attached to them. The earliest known hunting strategy for whalers would be to find an animal, align multiple boats alongside that animal, and basically force it to shore, where hunters would await to kill the animal when it banked up on the beach. However, this was a very labor-intensive effort, and it used many villagers to get one animal, and typically this animal would be used in entirety. Now, as the 17th century came along, we had major advances in the technology associated with whale hunting, and this, combined with an increased demand for whale products such as whale oil, allowed the conversion of whaling from a very small local practice into a major commercial industry. And we have two major innovations that were created by a man named Svend Foyn. The first of which was a steam-powered whaling ship, and this was going to allow us to be able to travel pretty far away from shore. And secondarily, they have something called the harpoon cannon. Now, the harpoon cannon is a specialized mechanism whereby the harpoon will actually explode when it lands on the surface of the whale. And that's going to embed the harpoon very deep inside the whale upon impact, which means they had an increased yield. So instead of having some animals that might be injured but escape, they had a much higher amount of animals that they were able to kill per shot. So the combination of these two inventions allowed commercial whaling to become a major industry. Now, sailors are able to pursue much larger animals and also reap greater yields than they previously were able to do. So, additionally, we have a high demand during this industrial era for lantern oil, which comes from whale oil. And they also used whale oil in soap production. We also are going to use whale products for a lot of other secondary markets as well. But if you look at one sperm whale, the blubber and there's a head compartment that also has a specialized organ that has oil as well. And from one sperm whale, you're able to extract approximately 25 to 40 barrels of whale oil. So they had a lot of different types of whales that they would hunt commercially. They had baleen whales, were a specialized type. Basically, these are whales that strain their food through baleen. So they're going to take a large sip, I guess, of water, if you will, expel all of the water, and anything that gets caught in the baleen strainer is what they're going to consume. These type of whales include blue whales, bowhead whales, and right whales. And in the baleen category, these three types of whales were considered the best to hunt and harvest for oil. In fact, they actually named right whales because they were the right species to hunt. This was determined because they were very slow movers, so they were easy to catch. And after they were killed, they floated on the surface. So you could kill several of them and attach little flags to them and then go and kill more and bring them all together before taking them all back on the ship. So you could leave basically acquired catch in the ocean in regions that you could then come back and pick them up because they floated on the surface. So that made them the right species to hunt because they were very easy to get large amounts of animals. There are also toothed whales, such as sperm whales, that they used for oil. So toothed whales are very special because they have an organ inside their head cavity called the spermaceti organ. And inside this organ, they're able to utilize that organ to extract oil. And additionally, it's of the purest content, or was considered to be the purest oil. So sperm whale oil was particularly highly coveted as compared to other types of whale oil. Additionally, these toothed whales were able to provide other materials, such as the tooths themselves, which were often used by sailors for scrimshaw. You may be familiar with scrimshaw as an artistic method that occurred during the whaling industry. Basically, they etched little lines into the whale tooth or whale bone, and then they would put soot or other types of darkening material into those edges to be able to make the image visible. But I digress. So it wasn't just whale oil that they were extracting from these animals, and eventually that whale oil would be replaced by kerosene, which would slowly decrease the dependence on whale products. But we also had several other whale products that were highly coveted. That include the baleen that I just talked about for straining. The whale would take a deep sip of water and then strain all of the water back out, and anything that was caught in their baleen would be something they would consume. But if you could take baleen and you could convert it into different products, such as clothing products, they used it in umbrella ribs, for example, also in ladies' corsets and in hat brims. So they used a lot of the different products from the whale, so not just the oil. Now, if I am going to tell you the history of whaling, I would be remiss not to mention Nantucket. Nantucket, located just south of Cape Cod, was one of the major regions of the whaling industry. And originally in this area, whale extraction was a passive process. So basically what would happen is whales would wash offshore and then they would harvest anything they could. But by the 1690s, the settlers wanted more oil. And so they began taking what we call a proactive approach, basically going out and hunting the whales. At this point, they were using much smaller boats than what we think of with whaling, so they would probably be able to harvest just a couple of whales per. Additionally, they used specialized houses to assist in whale detection. So these would be houses that were built on little higher ridges, basically, along the water's edge. And individuals would hang out in these houses and look for whales out on the water. Then they would find a whale and sound an alarm. So then the boats would be able to go out and chase after that whale. Now, come 1715, whalers are going to start venturing further and further off of shore. And that's because they're specifically looking for the sperm whales at this point. The sperm whales, again, they have that special organ called the spermaceti organ, and the oil extracted from that organ was considered to be a much higher quality than the oil extracted from whale blubber, for example. Unfortunately, though, sperm whales are actually harder to catch than some of the other whales because they live in deep parts of the ocean. So the whalers would have to travel very far offshore to be able to encounter these animals. So by the middle of the 18th century, they developed specialized ships that were much larger than the previous ships. And these ships actually had all of the equipment necessary to process the catch and extract the oil on board. And this meant that sailors didn't have to return back home to be able to process their catch. It also meant that they could hold onto their catch for longer periods of time because once it was extracted into oil, the oil was much more shelf-stable than, say, a whale carcass. And so for this reason, they were able to extract much larger amounts of oil because they were able to maintain at sea for much longer periods of time. So that led to Nantucket whale ships traveling the entire globe, and they were actually the highlight of the whale industry for over a century. They'd set out on very long-term expeditions. As I mentioned, they're able to process their catch right on board, so they have no reason to return to port except to sell product. And if they had very large reserves, they could store a lot of product before they had to return. So sometimes these expeditions would last upwards of 5 years. And this is a classic example of a commercial whaling industry dramatically impacting global whale populations. So they didn't just impact the whale populations in Nantucket because they traveled all over the globe. So that brings us to Hawaii. Nantucket ships traveled to the Hawaiian Islands, arriving in 1819, and it became very common knowledge very quickly that there were highly rich whaling waters near Japan. So if they were rich with herds, and so whalers would often come to the Hawaiian Islands as kind of a last step before traveling to Japan or on their way back from Japan. And before long, hundreds of ships were laying over in the Hawaiian Islands during the peak of the whaling industry. That's because the Hawaiian Islands are a central location between America and Japan, basically halfway between California and Japan. And so that is going to bring a huge economic boom to the islands. This is because weary sailors wanted to get off of their boats and they wanted to eat real food and not just the biscuits that they've been eating aboard the ships for a long time. They needed food and rest, which led them to seek lodging in the islands, which brought income and Western culture to the Hawaiian island chain. It brought a huge economic boom to the local populations. It was one of the major sources of income for a long while. Hundreds of whaling ships would come in during the whaling season, which would have 20 to 30, sometimes more men aboard, and each of those men would seek food and lodging and shelter and entertainment. And additionally, the ships themselves would want to resupply with food, etc., whatever necessities it would need for the next leg of their voyage. This provided great economic prosperity to the Hawaiian Islands. That led to whaling becoming a major contributing factor economically for over 40 years. In fact, certain regions, like the major ports, whaling was the primary source of the economic income, so it was crucial to the economy. And just to kind of put that in context, over 100 ships in 1 year alone stopped in the Hawaiian waters. In fact, the industry impact on Hawaii's economy was so great in terms of Hawaiian significance, particularly in regions that surround the major whaling ports, such as Lahaina, Hilo, and Honolulu. In fact, you can see the Whaling Museum is located in Lahaina, and it has a lot of old whaling artifacts. However, the whaling industry in Hawaii was brief-lived. In 1859, a whale oil substitute was developed, and because it was less costly to synthesize, you didn't have to extract it, you just had to create it, so you didn't have to hunt whales, and it also had a higher purity than derived whale oil, so it quickly replaced oil for lamps, etc., which was going to mark the end of the whaling era here in the Hawaiian Islands. However, whales remain a huge part of the Hawaiian economy in terms of tourism, as Hawaiian waters are warm and fertile, and the islands are surrounded by areas for breeding for humpback whales, calving, and nursing areas for humpback whales. And so that brings a huge tourist economy during whale season. Because Hawaii is one of the world's most important whale habitats, again, that brings a huge tourist industry surrounding whale watching, whale education, and outreach. In 1992, the area surrounding the Hawaiian Islands was designated a Whale National Marine Sanctuary. And this sanctuary underscores the importance of the Hawaiian waters and preservation of the humpback whale, which is now an endangered species. And it brings us right into commercial whaling. So commercial whaling is what we were seeing when we were talking about Nantucket. Commercial whaling is basically the hunting and killing of whales for the purposes of sale or trade of the meat or any of the derived products, such as the oil. Now, it's estimated that almost 3 million whales were killed during the commercial whaling industry's peak in the 20th century. And that caused a catastrophic decline of global whale populations. In fact, we don't even know how much of a catastrophe this actually was because we really don't have pre-exploitation numbers. However, some estimates demonstrate that sperm whales were depleted to about 1/3 of their pre-whaling population, and blue whales, mind you, these are very large whales, by up to 90% of their population was decimated during the whaling industry. So why did this happen? This happened because we had a huge demand for the use of whale oil. That increased the need, that increased the value. We also had several other whale products that were used, including whale bone, which is actually baleen, and the whale tooth, which was used for art like scrimshaw, etc. But the whale oil was really the major drive of the whaling industry. So it was founded approximately in the 1800s, and again, we had specialized inventions like those harpoons that we talked about, the explosive harpoons, and the specialized ships that were able to go for long periods of time off the coast. And another invention would be air compressors. Now, the air compressors are basically a balloon that you put inside a whale carcass, and that prevents a dead whale from sinking to the bottom. So you could, as I mentioned, leave all these whales on the surface of the water in a particular region and then go and harvest more whales in another region and then come and pick up all of your catch all at the same time. Those explosive harpoons were really important for increasing the penetration of the spears. So this meant that you'd have a higher kill rate per shot. It also increased the accuracy of your shot as well because you no longer had to expend strength. You could just worry on precision, and the strength of the explosion would ensure the penetration of the spear. So come 1904, we found a huge stock of whales in the Southern Ocean, and that made a second spur of commercial whaling, and that also led to the development of major factory ships in approximately 1925. And from this point on, we have a major depletion of traditional whale stocks because they are hunted on both a localized level and also a global level, because if we've eliminated our local population, that's going to prompt global travel so that we can go and extract the whales from other populations. Now I'm going to focus for a little bit on the Soviet whaling industry, which is a large industry that spanned approximately 4 decades, starting in 1948, and had multiple sets of factory fleets. This was a highly efficient processing factory. This was akin to Ford's automotive assembly line. The processing capability, basically they extracted the blubber and then discarded the remainder. So they tossed most of the animal overboard. It was highly wasteful in terms of what was left of the whale carcass, but remember, it's the oil that had the value. So the oil is what they actually desired. And the processing of the ships, as I mentioned, was great. They could get 200 small sperm whales. As I mentioned, you get approximately 20 to 45 barrels of oil per. So this is a lot of barrels per day. Also 100 humpback whales, so either this one or that one, either 200 small sperm whales or 100 humpback whales, or up to 35 of the pygmy blue whales. So as I mentioned, it's not a small industry. This is extracting great amounts of oil from these animals every single day. It also offered tantalizing incentives. So if you hit your bonus number for the year, If you hit your production target for the year, you would get a bonus. And then the following year, they would increase that target number. So every year, they'd increase the target and it would be hit and then attained. So this would lead to a rapid reduction of the global whale stocks. Additionally, they offered really high salaries. And again, as I mentioned, potential for bonuses. So the harder you worked, the more you got paid. And they also employed equal opportunity, which was kind of impressive. Women were also employed, and that didn't just include the lower level workers. They actually have an example of a female captain, Valentina Orlikova, and she commanded a catcher from 1947 to 1953. So, to summarize, Soviet whaling was efficient, organized, streamlined, and global, and this resulted in the decimation of global whale populations. The worldwide estimate of the Soviet whaling illegal take of whales is approximately 180,000 whales during that 4-decade time frame. So I'm going to give you a little bit of good news because all we've been talking about is all the decimation of these populations. So in 1946, the world recognized that there was a problem with the amount of whale populations that were being decimated throughout the world. And so they created something called the International Whaling Commission. And the IWC was created for the purposes of overseeing whale stocks, managing these whale stocks, and developing the whaling industry in an orderly fashion. They took responsibility for the conservation of the global whale populations, and multiple countries together pledged international cooperation to restore the whale ecosystems. So all this sounds fabulous, right? And in a lot of ways, it truly is. We protected multiple sets of whale species by this, through this International Whale Commission that includes the blue whales, fin whales, bowhead whales, right whales, sei whales, sperm whales, humpbacks, grays, brides, and minks. So they protected several sets of whale species, again, extraordinarily important. And they designated large whale sanctuaries, one in the Indian Ocean in 1979 and one in the Southern Ocean in 1994. And in both of these sanctuaries, commercial whaling is completely prohibited. This is very important, but it doesn't seem to go far enough. So whale sanctuaries are a very important attempt to provide long-term protection for different whale species. But remember, whale species are migratory. So that means that they might move in and out of these whale sanctuaries at will. And that means that it opens them up to illegal whaling. So anyone that is not abiding by the rules of the moratorium that the IWC put together, I believe it was 1986, is participating in illegal whaling. And some of the biggest offenders include Japan, Norway, and Korea, and then also individualized, privatized, basically pirates that are found in the different oceans. So there was a commercial whaling ban put in place in 1986. However, certain countries still practice commercial whaling. So Japan, for example, withdrew from the IWC. They withdrew their international cooperation in 2019 and considered continued whaling in their coastal waters from that point forward. In fact, they've been practicing whaling for quite a long while prior to that, but they've just recently openly announced that they are going to resume their whaling processes. Norway and Iceland put forth an objection and a reservation, and basically what that means is that they are thwarting the international regulation, and they resumed commercial whaling as well. If we focus on Japan, Japan has long been known to have a sordid history in terms of flouting these violations. In the decade of 1954 to 1964, Japan killed approximately 3 times more sperm whales than they reported, and they know that basically from the bycatch that was being sold at market. Also, they caught and killed 1.6 or more times the amount of bride whales than they reported. Again, this number is from 1981 to 1987, but over that 6-year time frame, they killed 1.5 times the amount of whales than they reported. Additionally, Japan is oftentimes you can find protected species at Japanese markets. They're regularly identified in these regions, and unfortunately, it's all self-regulation, which means that there is no actual way for the IWC to intervene. So all regulation has to come from undercover detection or whistleblowers because there is absolutely zero formal oversight. Korea is also also known to flout this ban. They were caught in 2000 by an undercover report by illegally harvesting fin and mink whales. These whales were found, their meat was found at market, even though they were not allowed to be harvesting them. And we also have a specialty loophole. So scientific whaling is a loophole that's exploited typically by Japan, but by other countries as well. And basically what happens with scientific whaling is that you're able to apply for a special permit, and that is permitted. So scientific whaling is permitted by the IWC and is not subjected to the ban that was placed on commercial whaling. So it's not subjected to the moratorium. So it's got a specialty provision within that moratorium that allows scientific research. Basically, what that means is that countries are allowed to kill whales for scientific research purposes. But unfortunately, there's no regulation on scientific whaling because although IWC permits it, it doesn't oversee scientific whaling. So basically, countries are supposed to submit a request for a special permit outlining their entire research proposal to the IWC so that it can be subjected to scientific scrutiny. However, the permits aren't issued by IWC. The permits are issued by the governments of the individual countries themselves. And when these governments have pretty much said out loud that they don't intend to follow along with the moratorium, there's really little that the IWC can do in terms of preventative or causing any sort of repercussions to these countries. So there were two major scientific whaling studies that were begun in Japan. The first one started in the late 1980s and focused on minke whales. It's called JARPA. And they killed approximately 6,000 minke whales from 1980 to the early 2000s. It actually did so well that it was expanded into something in 2005 so that it doubled the annual catch of minke whales. So previously they were approximately 450 a year, now they're approximately 900 a year. And they added two targeted species, fin and humpback whales, to their scientific whaling program. They started a second scientific whaling program in 2002 called JARPAN 2, and that was supposed to be in the North Pacific. And it's a long-term research program of undetermined duration, and that's literally how it was that's what they put down on the permit. And the objective is looking at feeding ecology, and the secondary objectives looking at environmental pollutions and stock structure, which are all very broad overviews and don't actually yield much publication. So approximately every year they catch 150 minke whales, 50 bride whales, 10 sperm whales, and 50 sei whales. You would think they would have a lot to show for that in terms of publication history, but unfortunately they don't. So this is a lethal harvesting program. So they get scientific samples from the whales, but they have to kill them to do so. And they've gotten lethally harvested samples from over 10,000 whales since 1980s. And every single whale that they kill, they are allowed to sell their meat at market and all of the whale byproducts at market. And we do presume that they made a profit, although we don't have numbers on that. So all of what is left over from the whale after they take their scientific samples, which are typically very, very small and from the brain or whatever, and they subsequently sell their meat at market. So as you can imagine, these scientific whaling loopholes have been heavily criticized. The first criticism is that the feeding ecology, which is what they're saying is their objective, is not actually relevant to the scheme for commercial whaling. So it just doesn't line up with the goals of the IWC. Secondarily, the programs have very little oversight, and all of their hypotheses are considered to be poorly testable. A testable hypothesis means that you can run an experiment or a series of experiments to be able to determine the conclusion. But they haven't outlined any specific testable hypotheses or performance measures. And the data that they use is very selective, so they don't use all of the data. So you never see any data from all of these animals, right? You only see data from selective animals. And they use it inappropriately in scientific terms for their estimation of their data. And last but not least, the heaviest criticism is that the programs unnecessarily rely on lethal sampling. We know now that we're able to take biopsies, for example, of the skin and return an animal to the wild. And last but not least, the publication record is absolutely terrible. Over the past 40 years now, since 1980, they have produced only one peer-reviewed publication. Super minimal considering how many animals they've killed, and they've created 137 other publications, but some examples of what those other publications might be include things like meeting reports or cruise propaganda, a conference presentation, etc. So these might just be pamphlets that are being put out. They're not actual peer-reviewed scientific publications. And last but not least, the goal of JARPAN 2 is to demonstrate that whales eat too much fish and should be culled by more whaling, and this is in their program capacity. And all data in the scientific community points to the contrary, which they have basically excluded when they write these grant programs. So to summarize, scientific whaling is off topic with the alignment of the goals of the IWC, has little to no external oversight, poorly testable hypotheses, and relies specifically on lethal sampling and profit from the meat sales and from the bycatch sales. And they have a terrible publication record and a biased study design. So the major question remains, why are these programs still allowed? The major criticism of the lethal methods is that we no longer need lethal methods to assess populations, which assessment of populations is an official primary objective of the IWC. But we now know that alternative methods can provide better data at a lower cost to address the actual objectives of scientific whaling, not the ones that Japan puts forward as the objective of their scientific whaling. Some examples of this include genetic analyses. We can take genetic analyses of biopsy skin samples, and we do this routinely with zoos and wild animal trafficking, and we can use these samples to help determine the genetic relatedness of the whale species, for example. Additionally, it's cheaper to obtain a biopsy than to harvest an entire animal. So now let's talk about population recovery. So we had a whale moratorium in 1986 where we put a ban on all commercial whaling. So the major question that comes from this is, over the past 35 years, what extent have the large whales recovered? And to do this, we have to look at multiple sets of populations. So the data is kind of complicated in a lot of ways. Number one, our pre-exploitation levels are basically non-existent. We have to use estimates because no initial population data was ever taken. And to be able to make estimates, we want to use our current environmental conditions, but they might differ significantly from the past, so it makes it very difficult to make those estimates. And it also makes it very difficult to blame the whaling industry if differences are seen because the environmental conditions might be the reason, right? Additionally, whales are migratory animals, and that makes population assessment difficult. It also makes protection difficult because they move in and out of these sanctuary regions, so protection is intermittent at best. Additionally, the life traits of large whales make recovery very difficult. First of all, they're very long-lived. They have very long delayed sexual maturity, so they take a long time to get to the point where they create offspring, and they have one offspring at a time, so very low reproductive rates compared to some animals. So that leads to the idea that recovery rates are kind of expected to be relatively slow and are going to need to be monitored over a much longer time span than some other populations. Now, we have demonstrated that there are populations of whales that have recovered, populations that are recovering, and some populations that are not recovered. And ongoing studies are trying to determine what the major factors are that lead to the rates of these populations recovering. So some examples of recovered populations are gray whales in the Eastern Pacific. This is actually lauded as our greatest success stories. We have reached pre-exploitation levels, and we have maintained genetic diversity in the gray whale population in this region. Additionally, we have recovered the population of bowhead whales that are found in waters named Berry, Chukotki, and Beaufort. And the humpback whale populations in the Northwest Atlantic and in the North Pacific regions have also recovered. We have other populations that are recovering, such as right whales that are found outside of South Africa, Argentina, and Western Australia in the waters that surround those regions. Humpback whales that are in the waters surrounding Western and Eastern Australia, and blue whales that are in the waters in the Northeast Pacific and Northeast Atlantic Oceans. However, we have a lot of populations that are not recovering, and I won't go over the specifics because there are more not recovering than have recovered, but that includes gray whales, right whales, bowhead whales, humpback whales, fin whales, and blue whales. So populations of multiple different species, we have at least one of each of these, if not many more of these, that we now know are not recovering, in fact, are still in decline, even though they've seen 30 years or so of these sanctions. So what are the reasons for the lack of recovery? And this is ongoing experimental design. So we're still looking into these reasons, but they believe that some of the reasons include something called extirpation. And extirpation is a local extinction event, and a population that's undergone an extirpation event is not expected to recover because there are no animals left to be able to survive and reproduce. Another reason for lack of recovery is something that we call incidental mortality. So any mortality that these animals are subjected to but is not related to whaling. And so there are some other things in modern society that might impact these whale populations that weren't found 200 years ago. Things like the fishery interactions or net entanglements, ships striking them, or pollution or habitat degradation. So anything that causes the death of the animals but isn't directly related to the whaling industry. And some other indirect effects, such as competition with local fisheries for their food source, or niche replacement. And then last but not least, illegal whaling, which is still being practiced in many parts of the world. So I know that I kind of gave you a gloom and doom lecture here, so I want to end with some positivity. So what are some things that you can do to help with the local whale populations? So first and foremost, always use reef-safe sunscreen. Reef-safe sunscreen helps ensure the viability of the reef, and the reef helps maintain those small fish. Small fish get eaten by bigger fish all the way up until they get eaten by whales. So that helps maintain a healthy whale food supply. Volunteering with activists that are going to help save the whales is always a good way to go as well, just to get more information and to help with outreach. And encourage any of your tourist friends to engage in whale watching behavior while they are here on the Hawaiian Islands. Tourism and whale watching have replaced whaling as a major commercial industry for the Hawaiian Islands, but it still involves whales and is going to be a way that which we can engage in outreach, right? And along those same lines, educate yourself and your friends and family about whale-friendly activities and never, ever approach a whale or whale calf if you encounter one. I appreciate you listening to my lecture today, and I can't wait to see you guys next time. Aloha and happy studying.